I'm very, very grateful to be back at Williams again. I have fond memories, and time moves in mysterious ways, and I only realized 3 days ago that it was 20 years ago, and somehow I thought it was just, I don't know, a couple of years ago. So I'm happy to be back. And I really want to thank Williams for hosting the symposium, and to Undine and Rita, who are younger scholars, for continuing to include those of us from the first generation in this discourse. I think it's extremely important in many ways for someone like me, Northern California Chicana, 10 years older than Asco. This was an overlapping experience of mine. So what I'm talking about today, to some degree, is from a voice of something that I think of as a collective. It's anecdotal. I am speaking as a colleague, as an artist, as a friend, and as a scholar. But because the differences in our generations, this moment in Asco now allows someone like me to look back retrospectively and to understand at a much deeper level than I could have when it was happening, what Asco really meant to us in the broadest sense. So what I want to talk about today is situating Asco in a kind of general sense within some of the motivations of the early movement. And then to talk in a little more specific way about the Asco member that I know the very best, which is Patssi Valdez. And then to really maybe come to some notion of what issues of youth identity and transformation really occurred in Asco that speak to those of you in the audience who are young students, also in a very parallel period. This took place 4 decades ago, so that is a stunning realization for those of us who were there. But in order to situate Asco and discussions this afternoon, I think it is important to talk about the larger movement. Some would say that Asco was a defined aspect of that movement. Some would say it was paradoxical. Some would say it was resistance. Some would say it was a counterpoint to that larger movement. And I can say it now, when you live it, you don't think it, but in retrospect, I see now that even the movement itself was never really cohesive. It was regional, it was fragmented. We talk about it now as though it was a large thing that we all agreed upon, but we didn't. And it did have characteristics. The early Chicano movement was nationalistic. It was an attempt to create an ethnic identity for a group of people that were neither American nor Mexican, and were trying to create a third sort of space of understanding. It was patriarchal, to be sure. And I say that as a Chicana who was in sort of the belly of the beast, and many of the things that I've written about in terms of other Chicana artists and my theories on domestic kind of really come from my own resistance to that tension within the movement. It was public, it was collective, it took many forms. Beginning in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Chicano movement was at its deepest level a movement of social justice and cultural identity, where the rights to land, language, education, and working wages was marked by an overriding theme of cultural reclamation. I am the daughter of a farm worker who immigrated to the United States during the Mexican Revolution in 1917. So that gives you some sort of a frame of what that first generation was about. And so we were reclaiming things our parents had set aside in an attempt to be American. We were never fooled in the 1950s by the idea that we ever could be American, because in that period of, what do you want to call it, you know, Donna Reed, Ozzie and Harriet, Nickelodeon, you know. We knew that wasn't what we were, but we didn't yet have a vocabulary to be what we could be. And so these cultural issues of reclamation, the Huelga movement, land and water rights in the Southwest, bilingual education, support for community institution building, the arts were central to that, and they served as a vehicle for expressing cultural history, founded in class, race, and gender. The first generation was a working class generation. That is not so true now. So these nutrient experiences that we talk about, they nourished us. They were experiences often in a rural setting. I give my family as an example. My father came in during the days when they brought workers in from Mexico. This is 1917, to do labor in places like Pueblo, Colorado. So my father came in as a laborer. I grew up working in canneries and understanding that our life was tied to the land. This was not true for people in urban settings. So these family histories, this regional terrain, this spiritual worldview, also had an urban component, and I think that's where the emergence of Asco is so important and so powerful. The Chicano movement was, for many of us, an artistic and cultural coming of age. A set of practices of self-definition that were grounded in our own development. And I think this is absolutely key. When I think about Asco, and our lives were very parallel. From 69 to 71, I was entering the Chicano movement. From 72, I was working Galeria de la Raza while Asco was becoming Asco. But I was 10 years older. And so the impulses of my own identity formation were different than the impulses of Asco members coming out of the blowouts and the walkouts in Los Angeles when they were 16 and 17 years old. That's two different worlds, same shared space, same shared chronology. So this artistic development in some way coincides with what Erickson talks about as the life history and the historical moment. And I want to talk about that at the very end because it's helped me to understand not just my own generation, but now it's helping me to understand Asco. That one's life history and the historical moment of the group you belong to sometimes intersects. And when it intersects, a kind of aperture opens up. And Erickson said that those people who buy a combination of unruliness, giftedness, and talent will rise to the surface, take control of their identity, and change the identity of their entire group. And to some degree, that Asco did. So I'm ahead of myself, and we'll talk about that. The role models for the Chicano movement were often the Mexicanidad movement in Mexico. The early years of the movement were critical points at which conflict also occurred over feminist dispositions. We didn't agree. The early conventions, like the Mayo Convention, were really fraught with incredible negotiations, some of which I think we shouldn't have made, but we did. So we foregrounded our ethnicity and we backgrounded our gender and sexuality, because that was what was called upon in a racist moment in which solidarity had to occur. And it was a very high price to pay. And I think when Asco came along, they allowed for a much more complex layering of those impulses that we in the first generation had sought to suppress or were forced into suppressing. So Chicano identity was motivated by many things, but in the visual language, I think we know that things like, in Los Angeles, for example, Hollywood, the cinema, car culture, freeways, were all part of that pop culture life. When I look back on it now, I see greater links, for example, between Almaraz's early paintings of the freeways and what happened in other aspects when Harry talks about riding the bus. I didn't understand it then. I understand it better now. What I also see now is that Asco, although appearing to be quite different, does have some ironic threads with groups like the Royal Chicano Air Force. For those of you who don't know who the Royal Chicano Air Force is, RCAF. They pretended to be pilots. They often wore World War II helmets and goggles and took pictures in front of planes that didn't belong to them. I think it was the Rebel Chicano Art Front was what it originally began. But some woman passing through from Canada or something said, "Oh, are you the Royal Canadian Air Force?" And she saw the logo. So they said, "No, we're the Royal Chicano Air Force." And so began this series of parodies about that. So that ironic sense of humor, I think is something shared. Different, Royal Chicano Air Force, Sacramento, rural, indigenous, Asco, urban, very, very different. But that thread of irony and humor is there to some degree. Other collective groups like Mujeres Muralistas, who were women painters and muralists, even the Toltecas de Aztlán, who were heavily indigenous, Malefe, all of those groups overlapped in the sense that they understood in a moment of mass movement following the original civil rights movement that we worked best when we worked collectively. So that collaborative and collective motivation really is a solid one that runs across the movement. What I have on the wall, and the image now, is by Carmen Gomez Garza. And I wanted to begin with it because I think it's one of the most polar opposite images that you could find for Asco. Carmen would let me say that, but I'll probably get a phone call if anyone tells you what I said. And that's to say that she came from South Texas, from Kingsville, one of the oldest, most racist places in the world. And she arose out of that in a particular way. And like others involved in narrative painting and cultural reclamation, she was really seeking to bring forward experiences from her own life. That aspect, muralism, these are later billboards that have come out of the early mural movement, were very much anchored in a rural sense of life. Labor struggles were primary. So I think in some way what happens then is muralists like Judy Baca, Judith Hernandez, even Carlos Almaraz in his early years in the Welcome movement. They established a vocabulary about muralism. Some say it comes from the Tres Grandes, some believe that it comes from community graffiti and placas. There are various threads that move through murals, but murals were on walls and they circumscribed space that belonged to a community. And then Asco comes along. And when you look at the work, this is a young Willie doing the wall that cracked open in 1972. And it's really about an incident, a moment of violence in the community that involves his brother, gang life. In that moment, he takes the mural to another place. And that other place has to do with situating within the narrative of the individual in their community, and not these grander themes of rural life. And I think it becomes one of the most critical urban statements that's being made. And think that it's exactly at the same time that people like Mujeres Muralistas are painting the Pan American mural in San Francisco. So these two worlds are side by side. But I see now that one of the things that I feel Asco achieved, and this is the walking mural, was taking the framework of the mural and animating it. And maybe because they lived in a city in which if you didn't have a car, it was the bus or it was walking, that animation takes on another moment. And so I think that for those of us who didn't understand then what that work meant, it's much easier now to look back at the instant murals, the walking mural, and see how, in fact, Asco was providing not just the animation, but a sort of avant-garde movement out of the traditional mural wall space in that same circumscribing of community, but doing it through performance. I particularly love this piece because I think Teddy Romo's written about it best, in which he talks about Patssi Valdez's role as the Black Madonna. She's in a black net gown. And the very first time, prior to the triptych piece by Yolanda Lopez, in which Yolanda is the running virgin. It actually predates it, and it is the first movement of the Virgen de Guadalupe. We used to have a piece called Virgen con chanclas, which are these kind of like scruffy little slipper shoes. But Patssi was already walking the Virgin before any of that happened. And it's only now that we can see that in that foundational period, Asco was creating a kind of vocabulary that perhaps in the larger movement we weren't prepared for. And I think some of the parallels might have come later when Yolanda Lopez does the Virgin suitcase, and the Virgin then becomes ambulatory. So the instant mural, the graffiti, tagging the museum, all become new symbols of a way of speaking of space. And this particular piece I like to show because it was very controversial among other Chicanas in a discourse on feminism, in which some people reading a single image and not knowing the entire piece, only seeing a single image, imagine that Patssi is bound to the wall. But in fact, what we don't know and learn much later is that she comes off the wall and she moves and she's empowered. And that breaking from the bound wall to the movement is in fact a larger feminist statement that we were unable to read then and can only see now. I see the early work of Asco now with a much greater sense of the adventuresome exploration that can only happen in youth, in which one is challenging one's own identity, and that their remarkable exchange of personal histories of struggle, their artistic styles of collaboration and taste, really created a new performance, a new form that for our generation was, I think, sometimes threatening, sometimes mysterious and not understood. And one of the areas that I've looked back on is the area that I've worked in for many years, which is the whole issue of spirituality, traditions of the Days of the Dead. And this is one of the traditional Days of the Dead from Oaxaca. And this is one of the early Carmen Moscato pieces of cut paper. So the Days of the Dead are a Mesoamerican tradition passed down in Mexican communities in which on November 1st and 2nd, the dead are honored. And there are constituent elements to the ofrenda or offerings. Those constituent elements often involve images of the Virgen and other religious iconography. They sometimes involve both terrestrial and celestial elements. And in my own work on the Day of the Dead, I innovated in an attempt to bring in Baroque traditions of vanitas, the specter of death. And I used I made a vanity for Dolores Del Rio. This is a very early piece. We used some of the yard shrines, the capillas, the little chapels, and we did mosaic. And these were pieces that were to establish a kind of spiritual geography, of way of looking at the dead. The Dolores Del Rio piece is probably my most well-known. And what that shows you is that eventually the traditions of the Days of the Dead become really central to a political historicizing for the larger Chicano movement, because we do homages to historical figures. So we use the Day of the Dead to build a history that we didn't have access to. And I took it into the direction of what some would say paganas, or the Mesoamerican traditions of nature. And simultaneously, I look now on this image from the Evergreen Cemetery, 1974, and I see that the practices of the Days of the Dead had different dimensions in different regions. And when I look at the Asco image now, I see it not in the same tradition that we were using, but I see it in a kind of juxtaposition, an almost paradox that is more important to me now than it could have ever been then, when I didn't understand it. And so I think that when we look at our practices of spirituality, we see them in a broader way. I remember hearing about the Last Supper on Whittier Boulevard, and I found it very interesting that it was referred to in the catalog as the first supper after the major riots. So I think that in my generation, in that founding generation, there was a misreading of an apolitical nature to Asco, which was not true. That in fact it had a political core, that the understanding of the war in Vietnam, violence in the community, the brutality of urban life, the resistance, the walkouts, the demand for a better education. Those were all political strategies of activism, but they were done in a new form. And I learned last night at dinner from Willie that the Stations of the Cross ended in his backyard in The Last Supper. And later, when it was reconstructed on Whittier Boulevard, it becomes the First Supper. And we see the introduction of an image, not of a suffering Christ, but an image that implies torture and that violence and brutality from which they were building a response. So it goes without saying in a way that there was a kind of separation, an inability in my generation to really read these pieces. And now we read them so differently. In a way, I suppose that's the business of art history, is looking back and being able to see things you couldn't see when the moment was actually happening. The parody, the costume, the humor, the irony, the cinema, they were all part of that. And even when I look at the other collective elements of the larger movement, muralism, spirituality, and posters and graphics, because you have to remember that in the early movement there were great attempts to organize people across different areas and regions, and posters the way that they were done. And they weren't fine art posters or screen work. That came later. The first groups like La Raza Graphics, Self-Help Graphics, all of those groups were really trying to build posters that could inform, educate, and organize people. So the early works of people like Esther Hernandez, and this is an installation based on an earlier poster of the Sun Maid, or Sun Madeleine, which was about farm workers and pesticides, and this is a piece that she does for her father. And one of the most important printmakers in that founding generation, Rupert Garcia, and he was also in Northern California. And one of the distinctions between Southern California and Northern California, the Chicano movement, was that Northern California was a different kind of urban experience than Los Angeles. San Francisco was more like a European city. The Third World Strike was happening in San Francisco State. There was a kind of multicultural and third world emphasis. Even Mujeres Muralistas had Latinas, had a mix of various people that were not Chicano. So to some degree, that graphic tradition gets set on its head by Asco, which is happening simultaneously. This is an early piece of Patsi's from the 1970s, which is a kind of self-portrait with barbed wire. Regeneración I'm learning much more about now than I knew at the time. I think Colin's essay in the catalog is really quite striking and was very, very revealing to me to look at it, because I've known Patssi for many, many years, and I've written about her and worked and looked at her work, and yet I didn't understand those drawings. When Harry was editing the volume of Regeneración, when Willie and Gronk and others, and they were working late into the night doing the drawings, I think they were establishing a kind of vocabulary of imagery that is only really totally accessible to the larger movement now to be understood. And I remember very much the No movies, because I attended one of the premieres. In a moment in ridiculous generosity, I gave my only No movie pin to Chon Noriega. And I have still one of my many regrets. So the early cinema of Chicanos was people like Jesus Trevino doing Yo Soy Joaquin or Raíces de Sangre, very much social protest, very much organized around those kinds of themes of justice. But I think Harry's disposition toward noir film, I think Gronk's very broad understanding of various aspects of gender and sexuality, Patsi's intuitions on glamour, all of that changed the form of film when they did the No movies. And for those who don't know, No movies were really not movies because they were not created from film, but from still shots. And they often featured Patssi as a villainess, done in the style of alarma, which is kind of like what would you compare it to? Tabloids. And I find it really interesting because At the very same time that this is happening, Chicanos in another setting are taking the work of Posada, and Posada was the original alarma guy. He was doing two-headed babies, violent scenes of domestic, abuse. He was doing all kinds of things that were part of these penny or 1 cent broadsides that were sent around. So the no movies are looking at violence from another position. So at the same time that they borrow from photonovelas, they have something that can only have happened in their generation. This is Patssi receiving her award. I believe it was Best Actress. I often think about this at the Oscars each year. It's so much better if they use the co-pro. I'm going to finish off with a little bit of an insight to some of Patsi's work, but I think I'm close to my time frame, so I'll move through it. Not quickly, but with some speed. What I understand now, and these are based on various experiences I've had interviewing Patssi and working with her, is that she existed both as the image of beauty, the icon, and the iconographer. So she did both. She did self-portraits and photos, but I think for those of us looking from the outside, we often wondered why we did not hear her voice. Why, when the names were spray painted on the front of the museum, hers was not? Why was she standing in the photo without her name below her? And so we set about to examine some of them. Recalling her own experience of discrimination as a small, dark Latina in a white, blonde world of beauty dominated in film and magazine, Patssi reconstructed herself through art. She became the icon of her group, an image of legendary beauty, fantasy, and style. Scholar David Garcia describes the famous photograph of Patssi Valdez taken in 1980 by Harry Gamboa. Quote, "She is frozen as an image of disorienting desire, of unconscious longing, there to lure, to disturb. She is without origins. Like a surrealist heroine, she lacks a definite body, a definite history. Her body teems with danger, destabilizes the fundamental certainties of reality with her presence. And her vague, bewitching beauty, the image of a woman that contests all recognizable images of Chicano and Chicana beauty." And to some degree, I sense that when you place that image against the images that we were creating of indigenous women, political women, regional or traditional beauties, it is revolutionary. Her image was a participatory construct that involved her fellow Asco members as photographers and conceptual performers. Yet it was Valdez herself that continued to transform her iconographic role. Her part in the collective varied from participant in performances and the creator of her own stage self-images to eventually a photographer in her own right and later a painter. The chemistry of Asco was based on the members' exchange of ideas and the autonomy of self-expression and also collective self-invention. And I've always said that a Mexican is just a Chicano waiting to happen. What does that mean? That means that the first moment of discrimination, you learn. The second moment, you respond. Two Chicanos is a couple, three is a caucus. We know how to organize. We know how to respond. And part of what happens out of that is that we remake ourselves repeatedly. When I joined the movement, I had already been a hippie. I had already been in the Black Power movement, my husband. And as a hippie, I had, those sort of naked images that you sort of like to put in a closet because the early movement was extremely repressive sexually, really it was. And Asco didn't partake in that. They were willing to challenge sexuality, gender, in ways that the first generation, even though they were parallel, was not able to do until much, much later. So Patsi's a part of that. She says, "I knew that I could create an illusion, something fabulous out of nothing. Send an image of power through the lens. Me, the dark Mexican. I was angry and rebellious. I wanted to send a message through the lens to confront society." So I often refer to her as the Glamour Patrol. She was always associated with concepts of glamour and beauty, and her images, as I have described them, as others have seen them over the years, and as you see them in the show, are really a kind of self-representation that was never seen in the Chicano movement before that. And one of the things that I want to end talking about really has to do with the role that Patssi plays in the development of a kind of materiality of desire, a momentary phenomenon. In the Chicano world, there's a term called rascuachismo, and it is making the most from the least, taking the discards of society and turning them into beautiful things. The yard shrines, the capillas, are parts of broken pottery, old Clorox bottles, tires with holes in them. We take what is left and we remake and remake, and that recycled beauty is called rascuachismo. But I wanted to write about it from the point of view of women, and so I coined a term called domesticana. And Patssi was one of the actually central people in the development of that kind of theoretical understanding for me. And that was to say that ruin and beauty and loss were all part of that kind of fugitive world that she creates with the bits of tinsel and the leftovers and the glamour. So this work of Domesticana is part of her installation trajectory, and by the 1980s and later, she is using some of those traditions of Days of the Dead, but she's restating them in forms that are much more contemporary. And Tomás Ibarra-Frausto talks of artistismo as very generally an underdog perspective, los de abajo. It presupposes a worldview of those who have not, but it is a quality exemplified in objects and places and social comportment. It has evolved as a bicultural sensibility. For me, Domesticana takes that and brings it into the domestic container of women's work, whether that's at your vanity in the kitchen, whether it's embroidery, whether it's makeup, whatever it may be. That is what Patssi does with a flawless artistry. The sense of residue that provokes the ephemeral joy and the momentary and fleeting. Her dazzling women, her domesticana, they all embody a sense of the tension between glamour, beauty, and ruin. The techniques of accumulation, adornment, abundance, and dispersal give the sense of chaos and motion central to her installations. Her later paintings of interiors carry that same destabilized and chaotic imagery of an intimate space, but at the same time a space of magic and power. I want to end by saying that while I'm speaking more specifically of Patssi, I think that the alchemical combination of the erudite sensibilities of Harry, the unbridled talent, and just absolutely, formidable skills of Willie, the dark world and the sexual extravaganzas of Gronk, and the life of Patssi of both ruin, love, and resistance, created something that never lived before. And in a way, it's a kind of version of that unruliness, giftedness, and talent that Erickson described when he talked about that life history and the historical moment. The Chicano identity was forever changed by the emergence of Asco. That there are layers of personal histories, whether it was the incident of the stabbing of Willie's brother, or whether it was Patsi's stories of family chaos and sadness, whether it was any of those one thing, it was all those things. It was the layers of a prophetic identity that produced a new Chicano. I want to say that I think in retrospect, for anyone in that generation now, those of you who are in your 20s, perhaps even into your 30s, I think it's a kind of model of what is possible. That Asco can mark now something happened in the past, but in that prophetic way, it foretells what can come in the future. That when people are unruly, unbridled, when they resist, when they challenge, when they reinvent, then all things are possible. So Asco now in my world makes sense as part of a movement that attempted, in the broadest sense, to change the trajectory of one of the largest groups of ethnic peoples in the United States. And the avant-garde that Asco occupied helped to break those barriers and create that possibility that those of you now who are young may live out in new ways. Thank you.